Good evening from New York. I'm Dan Rather. We're 3 days out from another possible government shutdown, and President Trump today shot down a bipartisan immigration bill intended to head the shutdown off. Before Republican Senator John McCain and Democratic Senator Chris Coons ever introduced their bill, the president tweeted out his opposition. The McCain-Coons bill would extend protection to dreamers brought here as children by undocumented immigrants. But it does not earmark funds for Mr. Trump's wall, which he demanded in his own proposal last week, a proposal with which something far greater is at stake than just another short-lived shutdown. For 50 years, the core element, the defining value of America's immigration system has been the family, enabling immigrants to thrive with help from their own building social foundations from which they could venture into American society. But it wasn't always that way. As the nation headed into the 20th century, a wave of new laws erected ideological corridors along the pathways into America. The walls of those corridors were constructed out of sheer racism. Our laws slammed a door in the face of Asians and Africans. The goal, the explicit goal at that time, was to freeze America's ethnic makeup, the way it was in previous years, forever. We implemented formulas, quotas, to do just that. America, the land of revolution, was to change no more, and it worked. Not until 40 years later did the country turn to face the racist barriers it had put up at its gateways. The driving force was a need for more skilled workers. So now, skills, rather than national origin, would open the door to America. Some self-described conservatives, however, were concerned, once again, about a change in the nation's ethnic composition. Without quotas of nationality, what other factor could ensure the consistency of America's ethnicity? Well, the argument went, America can't change that much if entry will also be determined by blood ties between new arrivals and the folks already here. That's right. The new immigration proposal would open the door to more family members because that was what conservatives wanted. In the 1960s, President Johnson embraced this upheaval in the way we looked at immigration and at immigrants.
We must also lift by legislation the bars of discrimination against those who seek entry into our country, particularly those with much-needed skills and those joining their families. In establishing preferences, a nation that was built by the immigrants of all lands can ask those who now seek admission, what can you do for our country? But we should not be asking, in what country were you born?
Now, what conservatives did not know at that time was how few new Americans would come over from the countries they liked, countries such as Norway, for instance. America's ethnic composition began to shift. Now, fast forward to 2018, and with our first black president in the rearview mirror, our new president wants to drag the country back by more than 50 years by cutting back on family migration. In return for granting amnesty to dreamers, those brought here as children who now want to stay, President Trump is demanding that legal immigrants no longer be allowed to bring their brothers and sisters or their parents. So, it is not surprising that family is no defense for undocumented immigrants against the president of the Family Values Party. Immigrants like Miguel Perez Jr., a U.S. Army veteran who gave us 2 tours in Afghanistan, and 2 American children. Now he's fighting deportation back to Mexico, where combat veterans are targeted for conscription into drug gangs there. But if America cannot decide whether the value of its immigrants arises from their nationality, their skill set, their relatives, or even their military service, you may want to consider whether it's time to stop spotlighting individual immigrant success stories altogether. It may be time to stop asking, as President Johnson did, what can you do for our country? Time to stop judging immigrants based on what they can do for our military, our economy, for us. It may in truth be time to gauge immigration based not on what opening doors does for us, but on what closing doors does to us, to all of us. We, America, now send federal agents to arrest the husbands and wives of American citizens as they show up to apply for residency. A study out last week says we are now committing more hate crimes. The number of violent incidents and bigoted rhetoric increased 46% across the country last year against Middle Eastern and South Asian communities. Another study, also out just last week, found a 258% increase in white supremacy propaganda on college campuses. They're coming now for our children. So, as members of Congress approach the deal this week on what our immigration system ought to look like going forward in the future, we are charged with watching them. Because immigration is changing us and will change us one way or another, accepting it or fighting it, it's going to change. Because the history of this nation reveals time and again that when we argue immigration, the heart of the matter isn't about who they are, it's about who we are. Now, straight ahead, the controversial Nunes memo and an exclusive report on the brand new health secretary. You'll want to hear it, so stay tuned.
Hey, Dave. As you can probably see, Skype froze. Frozen crashed.
You know, I'm watching that documentary on the Vietnam War, and there was a TV journalist in the middle of some tiny little village in Vietnam doing live TV as the soldiers were burning the Vietnamese huts, and it didn't crash. And that was 1965, and he was in Vietnam.
Look, we're doing interviews over there at youtube.com/TYT interviews, and we've done some amazing ones recently.
So now, of course, you know the person most widely considered to be the most progressive senator is Bernie Sanders.
Yeah.
Why not back him during the 2016 primaries? Why be a Democrat at all? And we're in a time where you cannot, in good conscience, sit on the sidelines of history.
As President Trump celebrates the passage of his tax cuts and the effect he says they're having on our economy, contrasted with, if necessary and you want to consider it, the stock market going down again today, however you feel about that, know that we should not forget the other agenda President Trump's party is pursuing, which is cutting benefits to some of the Americans who need it most. It may not be in the headlines, but they are working on it right now, as we're about to show you with our exclusive report. And if you listen closely enough, you will hear them say so. As soon as the president and his supporters passed those tax cuts, they announced their intention to move on to benefits for the poor, death by 1,000 budget cuts. But when even tiny cuts prove politically impossible, they resort to other methods. It starts with language. Take Medicaid. Presidents of both parties tried for decades to help America's needy pay for health care. Some even wanted to just give them health care. In 1965, We got Medicaid, giving states money to provide, in essence, for those too poor to buy it for themselves. Medicaid was not to be earned. It was not to shame those who received it. The shame, many thought, if there was any, was ours for not doing more sooner. But Medicaid got passed in the 60s. And since then, Medicaid has become, of course, incredibly popular. So, the first step in doing away with Medicaid, as I mentioned, is language. First, they start talking about Medicaid not as something we do because it is right, but as something people must earn. It's happening right before our eyes. Listen to how Speaker Paul Ryan last week on camera used language to shift the very bedrock of government assistance to the poor. Not to assist people anymore, but to make them earn assistance or lose it if they don't.
Wages are going up, benefits are going up, businesses are expanding. Consumer confidence is at a 17-year high, while unemployment is at a 17-year low. Tax reform is working. But one of the reasons we are here in West Virginia is because we want to build on this success of 2017 in 2018. We need to close the skills gap in this country, and we need to help people move from welfare to work so that they can tap their true potential.
The very next day, the new Health and Human Services Secretary, Alex Azar, announced that the Trump administration was granting a waiver to let Indiana impose a work requirement on Medicaid. The Trump administration has now given waivers to 2 states, Kentucky was first, to turn health care into something poor people must earn. Or, as Secretary Azar put it on Friday, give poor people incentive not to be poor.
Indiana will be working with 130,000 able-bodied adults who will now have opportunities and incentives to find work.
When Secretary Azar did not say, what he didn't say, is what we have found in our report tonight. One of the companies Indiana pays to keep its Medicare costs down is called HMS. Now, here's how it works. HMS doesn't actually lower the price of health care. They don't advocate, for instance, for states to join together and negotiate lower prices. Instead, HMS finds other people to pay the bills. Another insurance plan you might have, which may or may not raise your premiums, or maybe your spouse has a company health plan. Either way, HMS will find out, making HMS a potential contender when the state of Indiana hands out its contract for hunting down jobless Medicaid recipients. Now, until 3 months ago, the HMS Board of Directors included Alex Azar. We asked Health and Human Services about Mr. Azar's role in the Indiana decision and the role of his old company. A spokesman told us that HMS was not a party to Indiana's waiver request, and so, and I quote, under his ethics agreement and federal law, the Secretary may participate in the Indiana waiver, unquote. Wall Street, however, seems to think HMS does stand to benefit from work requirement waivers in Indiana or elsewhere. When HMS CEO William Lucida was asked last May about work requirements, he told Wall Street analysts, quote, there is always potential for additional opportunity when it comes to eligibility-related services, unquote. Now, we don't know how much Indiana pays HMS for its current work. The contracts we saw show HMS gets 13% of whatever Medicaid costs it recovers. We should note, by the way, that Indiana estimates some 33,000 residents will lose their Medicaid coverage once these new requirements kick in. It all started with language, speaking of health care as something you have to earn. And now America's economy is so great again that states like Indiana can afford to pay rich corporate executives to help deny health insurance to America's poor. As a footnote, there are other states applying to turn health care into something you earn. Azar's agency will be signing off, and we'll be watching. The Nunes memo and what it demands of us right after this.
Do you trust the establishment media?
The United States economy has never been better. Monetary policy is spectacular.
Everybody thought Jamie Dimon was the king of Wall Street last week. Well, it might be Ken Lewis now. He takes the crown. The best sales force out there is Merrill Lynch, and now it goes to BofA. It's pretty amazing.
Pretty amazing. Lewis now. Buying opportunity.
I do think this is a buying opportunity. We're going to see a stabilization and just a tremendous snapback.
The rally will be jaw-dropping.
The Occupy Wall Street movement is not a spontaneous protest against economic inequality.
This is what we mean by the establishment press.
It is a well-thought-out campaign.
To bring down the infrastructure of this country.
The embarrassment is that I'm given credibility in this world because of the disappointment that the public has in what the news media does.
I'm the former chairman of the Veterans Committee, and I learned a little bit about the cost of war. What the president is trying to do, and I agree with him, is to do everything that we can without going to war.
So what do you say to your critics? I'm talking about Democratic critics who say, you know what, he's really just a socialist pacifist.
I very rarely read in any coverage of Bernie that he's a socialist.
Bernie Sanders is a socialist, for God's sake.
Most analysts are saying that Hillary Clinton's going to win in a landslide.
I continue to believe Mr. Trump will not be president.
We've got Trump at 279, 259.
Wait a minute. No. Winning the presidency. I know you don't believe that. Sorry to laugh. We're not going to be polite anymore. You know what we're going to do? We're going to fight back.
Fight for a free and independent media. We're done with politeness. We fight back.
President Trump today called for what he sees as an alleged lawbreaker to be, quote, stopped, unquote. The lawbreaker is a Democratic lawmaker, Congressman Adam Schiff, accused by the president of leaking and who wants to release his party's response to the so-called Nunes memo. But everything we need to understand about the full implications of the Nunes memo can be divined from two facts we already have. The Nunes memo, of course, was created by Devin Nunes, chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, primarily to challenge the integrity of a warrant the FBI got to investigate Carter Page, a Trump campaign advisor. The memo's release on Friday dominated America's national discourse over the weekend and will echo loudly for weeks to come. But two revealing facts should shape how we hear those echoes. Fact one, on Friday, Chairman Nunes revealed that he did not read the FBI's warrant application before issuing his memo, which was about that warrant application.
Did you write it?
Myself, Trey Gowdy, our two investigators, and then obviously checked by the lawyers and the rest of our committee members.
Did you read the actual FISA applications?
No, I didn't.
Fact two, the Washington Post reported that President Trump declared himself vindicated by the Nunes memo without actually reading the Nunes memo. So, Nunes didn't read the warrant application his memo was about, and then President Trump did not read the Nunes memo about the warrant application that Nunes had not read. Why are these two facts so important to understanding all of this? Because whatever role Russia played in the election, Russia is not the most serious threat here. At worst, Russian propaganda is a virus. And if we no longer even read the stuff our decisions are supposed to be based on, we're no longer able to inoculate ourselves against any propaganda. And then it won't matter if we stop the Russians. We'll get played by anyone. China, you can be sure, is watching. Extremists on our own soil are figuring out how to play us against each other if all we care about is tribalism. And it's already happening. On Saturday, a new poll found that only 38% of Republicans now have a favorable view of the FBI. That's America's law and order party, turning on the premier federal law enforcement agency. Now, the irony is we are supposed to be skeptical of the FBI. We're supposed to be skeptical of all power. I'm old enough to remember when Republicans applauded law enforcement for bias against its targets. But the answer to paranoia about the FBI is not blind allegiance to the FBI. Remember, Republican politicians stood by the FBI through its assaults on Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. They stood by the FBI through wholesale targeting of Muslims and the agency's unseemly interest in everyone from Occupy Wall Street to Black Lives Matter. Only now is FBI overreach, quote unquote, a concern. Russia didn't do that. We did. And yes, without trying to strike any false equivalency, to varying degrees, both sides do this. Some on both sides, anyway. Some said the Nunes memo revealed treason. Some said releasing it was treason. Each side so invested in the evil of the other that it merits any measure against them, justifies any shortcut. Now, to give you an example, what we cut from that Nunes soundbite, here's what we didn't play earlier when we explained why he didn't read the warrant application.
Did you read the actual FISA applications?
No, I didn't. And this has been one of these bogus news stories that have been put out. So the agreement we made with the Department of Justice was to create a reading room and allow one member and two investigators to go over and review the documents. I thought the best person on our committee would be the chairman of the Oversight Committee, Trey Gowdy, who has a long career as a federal prosecutor, to go and do this.
That's a fair point. When we're obliged by the duties of journalism or just good citizenship to admit, if you oppose President Trump, it may not feel good, but conceding a point does not mean conceding moral high ground. It means we defend the process, the American process of debate and disagreement to eventually reach consensus. And we need that spirit now more than ever, because Nunes says more memos are coming about more American institutions, not just the FBI. And it's high time we remember how we deal with this, with the tantalizing promise of documents that will prove us right. From McCarthy's list of communists to Barack Obama's birth certificate or Hillary Clinton's emails, we've all too often fallen for the promise of the magic revelation. And lately, it's taken us too long to wake up to those false promises, to recognize that these promises carry so much more weight in their absence, their anticipation, than in their actual release. If nature abhors a vacuum, it's too often our nature to fill it with self-serving speculation. We have become so confident in our ability to cherry-pick and read without context that the president can now say anything, certain that his tribe can misinterpret any evidence in his favor, no matter how flimsy or damning. This has armored him to strike at our institutions, the free press, Congress, the courts, our culture, painting any that stand against him as disloyal, a threat to his power, and therefore a threat to the nation, as he makes the argument. And he's done more than that. He has degraded the defining character of the American project, the virtue of institutions engineered to stand against him, which is to say, to stand against power, our system of checks and balances. The president has led Americans to hate, in many ways, to hate truly what makes America great, poisoning the core of American principle that the system is supposed to be adversarial. It's designed to motivate people within our various institutions to counter, to question other institutions, checks and balances. If we now reject that, If we turn a blind eye to those real American values, then Russia or China can just sit back and watch, because whatever damage they might inflict upon us will be dwarfed by what we do to ourselves. I want to share some stories we're watching and a closing thought with you in just a moment.
Hey, Dave. As you can probably see, Skype froze. Froze and crashed.
You know, I'm watching that documentary on the Vietnam War, and there was a TV journalist in the middle of some tiny little village in Vietnam doing live TV as the soldiers were burning the Vietnamese huts, and it didn't crash. And that was 1965, and he was in Vietnam.
Look, we're doing interviews over there at youtube.com/TYT interviews, and we've done some amazing ones recently.
So now, of course, you know the person most widely considered to be the most progressive senator is Bernie Sanders. Yeah. Why not back him during the 2016 primaries? Why be a Democrat at all? And we're in the time where you cannot, in good conscience, sit on the sidelines of history.
Here's some other stories we're keeping an eye on and think you should. The scandal over a Catholic Church cover-up of a sex scandal in Chile reached the Vatican today. After Pope Francis last month said none of the victims ever came forward to him, the Associated Press now reports has obtained a letter sent to the Pope by a victim in 2015. The letter was delivered to the Pope, the AP says, detailing the victim's abuse and suicidal thoughts. Pope Francis has continued to defend a bishop in Chile who denies not only knowing anything about, but even witnessing the alleged abuse. The Vatican is sending an investigator to take statements from the man who sent the letter, along with other potential victims and witnesses. The New England Patriots weren't the only ones to come up empty at the Super Bowl last night. A commercial used an excerpt of Martin Luther King extolling the virtues of service to extol the virtues of Dodge Ram trucks. Dodge drew criticism from viewers, including the King family and the King Center. The ad aired 50 years to the day after King's actual address. And in case you hadn't noticed, this is also Black History Month. Every February now is by official decree. Folks, I've been told numerous times in recent years, when it comes to newscasts, note but don't spend much time on Black History Month. Most of the audience, it said, isn't interested. I'm also often told, don't recite much, if any, poetry on the air. So the saying goes, the audience tends to tune it out. I don't believe in the advice on either count. So, in honor of Black History Month, a poem by the great Langston Hughes, a poem which I believe will resonate with Americans of every race, ethnic background, and religion, especially in this moment of our nation's history. It's titled Democracy. Democracy will not come today, this year, nor ever through compromise and fear. I have as much right as the other fellow has to stand on my 2 feet and own the land. Our tired soul of hearing people say, let things take their course, tomorrow's another day. I do not need my freedom when I'm dead. I cannot live on tomorrow's bread. Freedom is a strong seed planted in a great need. I live here too. I want freedom, just as you. Democracy by Langston Hughes. Finally tonight, the most important story maybe, and one we should never take our eye off of, and that is North Korea. This week will mark the opening ceremonies of the Winter Olympic Games in South Korea. The North is sending a delegation, and the two sides have opened a dialogue for the first time in years. But before the torch is lit, the Trump administration has a message for anyone feeling swept up in the sudden camaraderie between the two Koreas. Forget about it. President Donald Trump has dispatched his Vice President, Mike Pence, to represent the United States and deliver a message. According to Pence's communications director, the Vice President will remind the world that anything the North Koreans do during the Olympics is a, quote, charade to disguise the reality of the oppression inside North Korea. Unquote. Here's another quote. We're not going to let the North Korea propaganda machine hijack the messaging of the Olympics, unquote. It's no small irony that the theme of this year's opening ceremonies is about a world made peaceful by the power of communication and connection. With that, I'll leave you for this news cycle. The Young Turks is next, and we'll be back with the news at this same place and time, 5:30 Eastern, every Monday. Until then, Dan Rather reporting. Stay steady.